Welcome to Books and More, the channel dedicated to bringing you powerful insights from the world's most impactful books, distilled clearly, thoughtfully, and in a way you can apply to your daily life. In today's video, we explore No Rules Rules, the groundbreaking book that uncovers the bold cultural principles behind Netflix's rise to global dominance. From radical candor to total freedom and responsibility, this book reveals how a company can break every traditional rule and still thrive. If you're passionate about leadership, innovation, and high-performance teams, this summary is for you. Stay tuned and keep learning with us. Introduction. A culture of freedom and responsibility begins with the courage to change. In the introduction of No Rules Rules, I invite you into a journey of discovering a corporate culture that defies everything we've long considered best practice. For decades, companies have relied on rules, controls, and processes to ensure efficiency and reduce risks. But at Netflix, we chose a different path, trusting people more deeply than most organizations dare to, and in return, holding them to a higher standard of responsibility than they may have ever experienced. This introduction sets the stage for a cultural reinvention unlike anything seen before. The story begins in 2001 when the dot-com crash forced Netflix to lay off one-third of its workforce. I feared the company would slow down, struggle, or even collapse. But the opposite happened. With fewer people, but the right people, the company became more agile, more creative, and far more effective. It made me ask, why does a smaller team perform better? The answer became clear. When only the most capable, driven, and self-managing employees remain, the need for rules disappears. High talent density unlocks speed, trust, and innovation. This realization led to a deeper truth. Most corporate rules exist to manage the lowest performing employees. Policies are built to prevent mistakes from the weakest links. But in doing so, organizations unintentionally constrain their strongest people, the very ones who fuel growth and creativity. If we wanted Netflix to become the most innovative company in our industry, we couldn't build more fences. We had to remove them. From that moment, the core of our culture emerged: freedom and responsibility. Freedom is not chaos. Responsibility is not pressure. Freedom gives talented people the ability to act quickly, think boldly, and pursue big ideas. Responsibility ensures they act with maturity, sound judgment, and alignment with the company's goals. When these two forces merge, extraordinary things happen. But I also acknowledge in the introduction that Netflix's culture is not for everyone. It works only in companies where the pace is fast, competition fierce, and innovation essential. It requires eliminating rules that most companies consider essential: vacation policies, expense approvals, decision checkpoints. It requires deep transparency. And above all, it requires courage, the courage to trust, to remove control, to expect excellence, and to accept risk. The introduction ends with an invitation. Set aside traditional assumptions about management. Allow yourself to explore a model that might feel counterintuitive, even uncomfortable. The goal is not for you to copy Netflix, but to understand the logic behind these unconventional choices. If you want to unlock creativity, speed, and accountability inside your own organization, this journey may reshape the way you think about leadership. Are you ready to enter a world where rules are broken and innovation thrives? Chapter 1. A great workplace is stunning colleagues. In Chapter 1, I take you to the very foundation of Netflix's culture, an insight that transformed the way we built teams and shaped everything that came afterward. A great workplace, I learned, isn't defined by fancy perks, unlimited snacks, or beautifully designed offices. A great workplace is where you are surrounded by stunning colleagues, people who elevate your thinking, challenge you constructively, push the boundaries of what's possible, and inspire you to bring your best effort every single day. This chapter is the story of how Netflix discovered the true value of talent density and why it became the first pillar of our culture of freedom and responsibility. The journey begins at one of the toughest moments in our history, the layoffs during the dot-com crash in 2001. Losing a third of our workforce felt like a devastating blow. I feared morale would plummet, creativity would slow, and productivity would crumble. But something unexpected happened. With fewer people, but with the strongest, most self-driven people remaining, the company became faster, more focused, and more innovative. The office energy shifted. Meetings became sharper. Problems were solved faster. There was a sense of clarity we hadn't experienced before. This experience forced me to confront a truth that most companies avoid. Having fewer great people is far more powerful than having many adequate ones. The reason is simple. When you mix high performers with average performers, the average ones drag the team down, not always intentionally, but inevitably. The best employees end up carrying more weight, compensating for others' weaknesses, or slowing their own pace to match the team's. In the short term, the company avoids discomfort by keeping those nice but not exceptional people. In the long term, it pays the price with mediocrity. This is why Netflix adopted an uncompromising principle. We hire and keep only the best people for each role. Not the pretty good, not the experienced, not the hard-working but limited. The best. It requires courage, honesty, and a willingness to make tough decisions, but the payoff is enormous. A team filled with truly exceptional people doesn't need layers of management or rules. They don't need babysitting, they don't wait for instructions. They create, they solve, and they move with the natural rhythm of excellence. In this chapter, I explain how we began thinking differently about compensation and retention. In many companies, people stay because of loyalty or tenure. At Netflix, we wanted people to stay only if they were the best fit today, not because they had been valuable in the past. This thinking helped shape what later became known as the keeper test. If a top employee said they were leaving tomorrow, would you fight to keep them? If not, the honest and kindest thing to do is to let them go with a generous severance. I also emphasize that building a team of stunning colleagues is not about creating pressure or competition. It's about creating an environment where excellence feels normal, where creativity thrives because everyone is operating at a high level. When you work with brilliant people, you feel safe pushing boundaries. You grow faster. You aim higher. The team becomes more than the sum of its parts. The chapter closes with a fundamental insight. Culture begins not with rules, but with people. You cannot build freedom, creativity, or speed if you don't have the right individuals. The foundation of everything we later built, transparency, candor, autonomy, rests on this one truth. A workplace filled with stunning colleagues doesn't need control mechanisms. It needs trust. And when trust becomes the default, innovation flourishes. Chapter 1 lays the cornerstone of Netflix's culture. Great people make a great company, and everything else follows from that simple, powerful idea. Chapter 2. Say what you really think. The power of radical candor. In Chapter 2, I guide you into one of the most challenging but transformative components of the Netflix culture: radical candor, the practice of saying what you really think with good intentions in a direct, timely, and constructive way. If the first chapter explains who we hire, this chapter explains how we work together. A high-performing team cannot thrive when people hold back the truth, avoid uncomfortable conversations, or hide concerns behind politeness. To unleash the full potential of a talented workforce, candor must be the norm, not the exception. I begin by acknowledging a universal human truth. Most people hesitate to give honest feedback. We are afraid of hurting feelings, damaging relationships, or being misunderstood. This fear leads to silence, and silence leads to stagnation. Problems fester beneath the surface, misunderstandings multiply, and small issues grow into crises because no one was willing to speak up. At Netflix, we learned early on that innovation depends on open communication, and that requires a culture where people feel safe to tell the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. To build such a culture, we introduced clear principles for giving and receiving feedback. Feedback must be aimed at helping the other person, must be actionable, must be delivered promptly, and the receiver must express appreciation, even if they choose not to act on it. These guidelines transformed feedback from a potential threat into a powerful tool for collective improvement. When people understand that criticism comes from a place of support, not judgment, they become more willing to listen, learn, and grow. In this chapter, I describe real examples of candid conversations inside Netflix, moments when colleagues told each other, openly and respectfully, that a presentation was confusing, a decision was misguided, or a behavior was undermining team trust. In many workplaces, such feedback would be seen as insubordination or rudeness. But at Netflix, we treat candor as a form of respect. You speak up because you care about the team and want the person to succeed. A crucial insight I highlight is that candor must flow in all directions, upward to managers, downward to direct reports, and sideways among peers. Leaders cannot demand candor if they cannot tolerate criticism themselves. I recall moments when my own team confronted me, telling me I was micromanaging or that I was slowing down projects with unnecessary involvement. These comments were not easy to hear, but they made me a better leader. To me, those moments proved that candor works only when leaders model vulnerability and openness. Another essential point in this chapter is the idea that candor eliminates guesswork. When people speak transparently, they don't waste time interpreting hidden agendas, reading between the lines, or worrying about office politics. They can focus on the work. They can innovate faster. They trust each other more deeply because there's no ambiguity. In a fast-paced environment where decisions must be made quickly, candor becomes a strategic advantage. I also address the misconception that candor equals harshness. Candor is not an excuse to be blunt or unkind. It requires emotional intelligence, knowing how to deliver feedback in a way that challenges without humiliating, that pushes someone forward rather than shutting them down. When done right, candor strengthens relationships. It builds confidence. It creates a shared understanding that everyone is committed to excellence. The chapter culminates with a key idea: candor makes freedom possible. Without honest communication, autonomy becomes dangerous. People will make decisions based on incomplete or incorrect assumptions. But when feedback flows freely, the team stays aligned, informed, and continuously improving. Candor, therefore, is the glue that holds a high-talent organization together. Chapter 2 reinforces a fundamental truth. Brilliant people need honest conversations. When individuals feel empowered to speak their minds and supported when they do, teams become more innovative, more resilient, and ultimately more human. Chapter 3. Removing Controls. Creating Space for Freedom and Responsibility. In Chapter 3, I dive into one of the most unconventional and defining moves we made at Netflix: eliminating traditional controls. This chapter explains how we removed vacation policies, expense approvals, and other forms of bureaucratic oversight. Not because we wanted to be rebellious, but because we wanted to unleash the creativity and judgment of exceptionally talented people. When you build a team of stunning colleagues and establish a culture of candor, the next logical step is to give people the freedom to operate like true professionals. I begin by revisiting the uncomfortable truth behind most corporate policies. They exist not to empower high performers, but to protect organizations from low performers. Rules, checklists, and rigid approval structures are designed to prevent mistakes by the weakest employees. But the cost of these systems is enormous. They slow down the strongest people, stifle innovation, and create an atmosphere where compliance matters more than good judgment. At Netflix, we realized that if we were serious about talent density, we needed to remove the controls built for people who didn't belong in our organization to begin with. The first major control we removed was the vacation policy. Instead of tracking days off, requiring approvals, or limiting how much time employees could take, we simply abolished the entire system. The new rule was simple: take time off whenever you need, as long as your work is well handled and your team is aligned. Many outsiders predicted chaos, imagining employees taking months off or abusing the freedom. Yet, the opposite happened. People took time off responsibly, often less than before, and enjoyed a sense of autonomy that made them more committed and energized. When adults are treated like adults, they act like adults. We took the same approach with expenses and travel. Gone were the forms, the signatures, the approvals. Instead, we replaced the entire structure with a single guiding principle: act in Netflix's best interest. This principle demanded far more judgment and responsibility than the old system ever could. Employees now had to think critically about spending decisions, consult with peers, and evaluate trade-offs. Instead of relying on a manager's signature, they relied on context, financial transparency, and their own maturity. In this chapter, I share stories illustrating the challenges and successes of removing controls. There were occasional mistakes, an unnecessarily expensive flight, or a hotel choice that exceeded what was reasonable. But instead of reinstating rules, we used these moments as opportunities for learning. We'd ask, what context was missing? What information would have led to a better decision? Mistakes weren't punished, they were analyzed so the whole team could improve. An important point I emphasize is that freedom only works when paired with responsibility and transparency. You cannot remove controls if people don't understand the company's financial health, strategic priorities, or risk tolerance. That's why we committed to sharing detailed financial information across the organization. When employees know the big picture, they make smarter choices than any policy could dictate. I also describe the crucial role of leadership in this model. Leaders must set the tone by behaving responsibly. They cannot indulge in lavish spending or make reckless decisions because the entire culture would follow their lead. Freedom without leadership discipline becomes chaos, but freedom with disciplined leadership becomes a powerful engine of innovation. The chapter concludes by reinforcing a fundamental insight. Rules are a substitute for great people, and great people are a substitute for rules. Once you have the right individuals, capable, honest, and aligned, you don't need layers of control. Removing controls isn't about being casual or permissive. It's about trusting talented people to operate with judgment and empowering them to move quickly. Chapter 3 marks the moment Netflix stepped away from traditional management and embraced a system built on trust. It is the turning point where freedom became the operating system of the company, unlocking speed, creativity, and a deeper sense of ownership across the entire organization. Chapter 4. Paying top of personal market. Investing in excellence, not average. In Chapter 4, I walk you through one of the boldest and most misunderstood principles of Netflix's culture: paying employees at the highest level the market will bear for their specific talent, not according to seniority, internal bands, or annual cycles. This chapter explains how compensation becomes not just a financial strategy, but a cultural foundation, one that fuels talent density, accelerates innovation, and eliminates the politics often found in organizations where people fight for tiny raises or titles. I begin by highlighting a truth that many leaders prefer to ignore. Most companies underpay their best people and overpay their mediocre ones. They let compensation drift upward slowly over time, driven by tenure rather than value. But in fast-moving industries, the market moves quickly, and so does the value of top performers. If your best employees can earn more elsewhere, you risk losing them, not because they want to leave, but because the company didn't make an intentional choice to keep them. At Netflix, we decided early on that we would never allow great talent to leave simply because another company valued them more. Our philosophy became simple. We pay each person what they would earn on the open market today, not next year, not according to company averages, but at the very top of their market value now. That sometimes meant raising salaries dramatically. Sometimes it meant hiring someone at a compensation level higher than their manager. And sometimes it meant paying more than what felt comfortable. But comfort, I realized, was the enemy of excellence. I emphasize that this compensation approach is not about rewarding loyalty or effort. It's about investing in the impact a person can deliver. When you have a team of stunning colleagues, each one generates outsized value. The financial return from having a truly exceptional person is often 5x, 10x, or even 100x what a merely good person produces. Seen through that lens, paying top of market is not expensive. It is the smartest possible investment. A major part of this chapter explores why Netflix eliminated bonuses and replaced them entirely with salary. Traditional bonuses create uncertainty, foster internal competition and often cause people to act in ways that maximize their bonus rather than the company's long-term goals. High performers don't need carrots to be motivated. They are driven by craftsmanship, impact, autonomy, and meaningful work. By shifting bonus budgets directly into salary, we gave employees predictable income and removed distractions. They could focus fully on the job, knowing they were already being paid at the highest level. Another key idea is transparency around salaries. Not public disclosure, but open, honest conversations between managers and employees. We encouraged people to interview with other companies, not as a threat, but to understand their real market value. If another company valued them more, we wanted to know and adjust accordingly. This practice reframed compensation from a negotiation into a partnership built on trust. I also spend time describing how this model demanded courage from leaders. It is uncomfortable to pay someone significantly more than you earn yourself. It is uncomfortable to raise a salary drastically in one move. It is uncomfortable to tell a good employee that they are no longer top of market and offer them a generous severance instead. But leadership is not about comfort. It is about making the choice that best serves the team and the mission. In a traditional company, managers cling to average talent because firing is painful and hiring is hard. At Netflix, paying top of market allowed us to avoid the slow decay caused by mediocrity. People stayed not because they were trapped by tenure or incremental raises, but because they felt valued and challenged among peers of equal caliber. The chapter concludes with the final lesson. Compensation is a cultural signal. When you pay people as if they are exceptional, you communicate trust, expectations, and respect. You attract excellence, you retain excellence, and you build a culture where every person is both empowered and accountable. Paying top of market is not about money. It is about creating the conditions where greatness becomes normal. Chapter 4 reinforces one of the core truths of Netflix's success. The best people don't cost the most, they return the most. Chapter 5. Open the books. Transparency builds trust and better decisions. In Chapter 5, I reveal one of the most daring choices we made in shaping Netflix's culture: opening the books and sharing sensitive financial information widely throughout the company. This decision is often misunderstood, even viewed as reckless by traditional businesses. But for Netflix, transparency became the cornerstone that enabled freedom, accelerated decision-making, and pushed responsibility to every individual, not just those in leadership. I begin this chapter by confronting a belief held by many organizations that employees can't be trusted with financial details. Leaders worry that people won't understand the numbers, will panic when times are tough, or might leak confidential strategies. But withholding information creates something far more dangerous: a workforce operating in the dark. People cannot act in the best interest of the company if they don't understand its financial health, strategic priorities, or the economic realities behind difficult decisions. At Netflix, we discovered that trust grows fastest when information flows freely. So we made a bold move. We opened the books. Every quarter, employees were invited to presentations where we walked them through revenue, profit margins, cash flow, debt, content costs, and future investments. We showed them the numbers exactly as leadership saw them: no filters, no simplifications. We explained not only what was happening, but why it was happening. This level of transparency gave employees a sense of ownership and maturity that no rule or policy could ever replicate. I emphasize that transparency is not simply about data. It is about context. When people understand context, they make smarter choices. They spend money more responsibly. They take fewer unnecessary risks but embrace the right ones. Instead of relying on managerial approvals, they rely on judgment rooted in the big picture. Throughout the chapter, I share examples of how open financials transformed behavior. When employees saw how content costs impacted cash flow, they became more thoughtful in negotiating contracts. When engineers understood the global expansion roadmap, they prioritized projects that aligned with long-term strategy. When marketing teams saw subscriber churn trends, they adjusted campaigns accordingly. Transparency didn't overwhelm people, it empowered them. Of course, there were risks. Occasionally, someone would misunderstand a number and spread unnecessary fear. Occasionally, an employee would worry about what a negative trend might mean for job security. But rather than hide bad news, we believed in addressing challenges head-on, explaining realities with honesty and humanity. Over time, employees learned to see fluctuations not as threats, but as indicators, signals that helped them make better decisions. This chapter also explores how transparency reduces politics. In many companies, lack of information creates power imbalances. Leaders hoard data, and employees feel excluded or manipulated. But when information is shared openly, hierarchy becomes less relevant. People stop guessing motives or reading between the lines. They spend less time speculating and more time executing. Trust replaces suspicion. I contrast transparency with secrecy-driven cultures where employees operate in a fog, unaware of the company's true health. In such environments, people cling to rules because they don't understand the broader mission. At Netflix, transparency served as the bridge between freedom and responsibility. Without it, autonomy would collapse into chaos. With it, employees could act swiftly, confidently, and intelligently. Toward the end of the chapter, I address the fear of leaks. Yes, information could leak, but the benefits of empowering thousands outweighed the risk of informing a competitor. And in practice, leaks were exceedingly rare because employees recognized the enormous trust being placed in them. Trust inspires loyalty, secrecy breeds distance. The chapter concludes with a central insight. Transparency is the foundation of an adult-to-adult culture. When you treat people like responsible adults, they rise to the occasion. Open the books and you open minds. You create a workplace where people understand the stakes, embrace accountability, and contribute not just with their labor, but with their judgment. Chapter 5 establishes transparency as one of Netflix's greatest competitive advantages, an engine of clarity, alignment, and empowerment that few companies dare to adopt, but all could benefit from. Chapter 6. No decision-making approvals, trusting people over processes. In Chapter 6, I explore one of the most liberating and radical shifts we made at Netflix, eliminating decision-making approvals. This chapter explains how we went from a traditional hierarchy where choices were pushed upward for signatures to a culture where individuals throughout the company make significant decisions autonomously. This model might sound risky, even irresponsible, but it became one of the key drivers behind our ability to innovate quickly, scale globally, and maintain the agility of a startup even as we grew into a multinational organization. I begin the chapter by confronting a simple truth. In most companies, people spend an enormous amount of time waiting for managers to review budgets, waiting for directors to approve ideas, waiting for committees to assess risks. These waiting periods, often invisible in systems and spreadsheets, slow everything down. They sap momentum, kill creativity, and encourage risk avoidance. The unspoken message becomes clear. Don't think, don't act, ask permission. But in an industry as dynamic as entertainment and technology, slowness is a silent killer. At Netflix, we wanted people to act with urgency, confidence, and ownership. But that only becomes possible when you remove the need to seek approval. So we made a deliberate choice. Individuals can make decisions on their own, no matter the cost or scope, as long as they follow one guiding principle. Act in the best interest of Netflix. It sounds simple, but it demands deep judgment, maturity, and contextual awareness. This chapter explains that removing approvals does not mean abandoning structure. It means replacing control with context. Leaders do not sign off on decisions. Instead, they ensure employees fully understand the company's goals, strategy, financial constraints, and long-term priorities. A well-informed employee with strong judgment will almost always make better decisions than a rule-bound system. I share stories illustrating how this principle works in practice. For example, a content executive purchased the rights to a film for millions without seeking approval. In most companies, this would be considered insubordination. At Netflix, it was celebrated because she had gathered input from experts, analyzed data, considered risks, and acted quickly in a fast-moving market. Her decision aligned perfectly with our strategy, and because she didn't wait for approvals, we secured a competitive advantage. I also describe how the absence of approvals fosters a culture of peer consultation. Without a boss acting as a gatekeeper, employees naturally turn to colleagues for feedback. They refine ideas collaboratively, identify blind spots, and reach better conclusions. Peer review becomes a source of quality control, replacing the bottleneck of managerial authorization. One of the most important themes in this chapter is how removing approvals shifts responsibility. Approval-based cultures allow employees to say, "I followed the rules. If something goes wrong, it's not my fault." But at Netflix, people cannot hide behind process. They own their outcomes, good or bad. This ownership builds stronger leaders, sharper thinkers, and a more resilient organization. Of course, mistakes happen. Some decisions miss the mark. But we don't respond by adding new rules. Instead, we analyze the failure. Was the context insufficient? Did the person misunderstand a priority? Did they seek enough input? Errors become opportunities to strengthen judgment, not excuses to rebuild bureaucracy. In this way, freedom evolves through learning rather than restriction. A crucial part of this chapter focuses on the role of leadership. Leaders must resist the temptation to take back control or subtly pressure employees into asking for approval. Leadership under this model means coaching, not commanding. It means providing clarity, teaching judgment, and stepping aside to let people take the wheel. When leaders model trust and humility, employees gain confidence. The chapter closes with a core insight. Removing approvals is not about speed alone. It is about unlocking a culture where people feel empowered, accountable, and engaged. When individuals act because they believe in the mission, not because they fear breaking a rule, creativity flourishes. The organization becomes more than a hierarchy. It becomes a network of adults making smart decisions in real time. Chapter 6 demonstrates that when you trust talented people fully, you create a company that moves faster than competitors, adapts faster than markets, and grows faster than bureaucracy can slow it down. Chapter 7, The Keeper Test, Raising the Bar Through Courage and Clarity. In Chapter 7, I delve into one of the most defining and often controversial pillars of Netflix's culture, the Keeper Test. This chapter explores how we built a system designed to keep only our most impactful people, elevate talent density continuously, and ensure that every employee is surrounded by colleagues who inspire them. It is a chapter about courage to make hard decisions, to be honest about performance, and to prioritize excellence over comfort. I begin by sharing a question that changed the way we think about talent forever. If a member of your team told you they were leaving for another company, would you fight to keep them? If the answer is no, then that person should not remain at Netflix. It sounds stark, but it embodies a powerful principle. Keeping someone whose performance is merely adequate harms the entire team. High performers lose motivation when surrounded by mediocrity, creativity slows, and the culture begins to drift toward complacency. The Keeper Test forced leaders, myself included, to confront difficult truths. It required us to separate personal fondness from professional impact, to differentiate between effort and results, and to accept that someone who was great last year may no longer be the right fit today. Performance is not static. The company evolves, markets shift, and skill requirements change. The test helps ensure the team continually adapts. Throughout the chapter, I illustrate how emotional this process can be. Letting go of someone who is kind, well-liked, or hardworking is not easy. But when a person is no longer the best fit for the role, holding on to them is ultimately a disservice to the team, to the company, and even to the individual themselves. We offer generous severance not as a reward for failure, but as a respectful transition for someone who contributed meaningfully but may thrive better elsewhere. A key insight in this chapter is that candor and the keeper test go hand in hand. Employees cannot thrive unless they understand clearly how they are performing and what is expected of them. Leaders must communicate openly, frequently, and honestly, not waiting for yearly evaluation cycles. If someone is struggling, they deserve transparency. If someone is excelling, they deserve recognition. The keeper test is not a surprise, it is a reflection of ongoing, honest conversations. Another important theme is how this principle strengthens trust. While it may seem counterintuitive, employees at Netflix feel safer knowing that the company is committed to excellence. They know they work among peers who elevate them rather than drag them down. They understand that staying at Netflix means they are valued not for loyalty, but for impact. This clarity creates an atmosphere where people push themselves and each other to grow. I also discuss how leaders must apply the keeper test to themselves. Managers are not exempt. In fact, leadership roles face the highest standards because their influence is far-reaching. If a manager is not someone I would fight to keep, I must be willing to make the same tough decision I expect from them. This self-application reinforces humility and responsibility. The chapter explores common misconceptions. The keeper test is not about firing people quickly or ruthlessly. It is not about creating fear. It is about ensuring that every person is in the right role at the right time, contributing at a level that drives the company forward. When done right, teams feel energized, supported, and aligned, not anxious. One of the most powerful insights I share is that exceptional teams are built not by avoiding tough decisions, but by making them with compassion and clarity. When you combine stunning colleagues, radical candor, and honest evaluations, the culture becomes stronger than any individual pain point. The chapter concludes with a reminder: excellence is a choice. Maintaining a high-talent environment requires vigilance, honesty, and courage. The keeper test is the tool that helps us make those choices consistently. Through it, we build a workplace where brilliance thrives and where every person knows they are surrounded by the best teammates imaginable. Chapter 8: A Circle of Feedback: Building a Culture of Continuous Improvement. In Chapter 8, I explore the next evolution of candor at Netflix, creating a circle of feedback, a system where giving and receiving feedback becomes not a moment, not an event, but an ongoing rhythm that drives individual and organizational growth. If Chapter 2 introduced the importance of speaking honestly, Chapter 8 shows how we institutionalized candor in a way that strengthened trust, sharpened judgment, and elevated performance across the company. I begin the chapter by highlighting a fundamental insight. Feedback is most powerful when it flows constantly, naturally, and multidirectionally. Most organizations rely on yearly performance reviews, but these traditional processes are slow, political, and often too late to make a meaningful difference. At Netflix, we wanted people to improve in real time, not months after mistakes or missed opportunity. A high-talent environment cannot afford to wait for scheduled evaluations. It needs fast loops of learning. To make this possible, we encouraged employees to give candid feedback frequently and directly. But we went further. We built rituals and structures that made this behavior not optional, but cultural. One of these was the Live 360 feedback session, where teams gather face-to-face and offer each other constructive insights using a simple framework. What should the person stop doing? What should they start doing? What should they continue doing? These sessions can be uncomfortable, but they produce extraordinary clarity. When done respectfully and with positive intent, they strengthen relationships and drive immediate improvement. They also help remove ego from the process. Feedback becomes part of the job, not a personal attack. A key theme in this chapter is the importance of receiving feedback gracefully. At Netflix, employees are taught to listen without defensiveness, to ask clarifying questions, and to thank the giver, even when the message is hard to hear. You don't have to accept every piece of feedback, but you must be open to hearing it. This posture of openness turns feedback into a gift rather than a threat. I share examples of leaders, including myself, receiving tough feedback from junior colleagues. These moments are humbling, but they reinforce a critical truth. Candor only works when it flows in all directions. If employees see leaders embracing feedback, they feel safer to do the same. If leaders become defensive, the entire feedback culture collapses. The chapter also addresses the emotional challenges of a candid culture. Honesty can sting. People sometimes misinterpret intent. Not every piece of feedback is perfectly delivered. That's why we emphasize care paired with clarity. The goal is to help the other person succeed, not to showcase your intelligence or prove a point. At Netflix, good feedback is specific, actionable, and rooted in shared goals. Another important insight is how the circle of feedback reinforces excellence. When teams are constantly giving each other insights, they grow faster. They develop sharper instincts. They adjust behaviors before small issues become big ones. Candor becomes a tool of collaboration rather than correction. It creates an environment where improvement is expected, supported, and continuous. I explain how this process reduces politics as well. In traditional organizations, feedback is often weaponized, given only during reviews or stored as ammunition for future conflicts. But in a circle of feedback, nothing is hidden. Problems are surfaced early. Tensions are addressed directly. Transparency replaces resentment. Relationships become stronger because people know where they stand and what is expected of them. Toward the end of the chapter, I emphasize that the circle of feedback cannot exist without trust. People must believe that their colleagues want them to succeed. They must feel safe to speak honestly. They must experience firsthand that feedback is given with good intentions. That is why we link feedback so closely to our principles of talent density, candor, and autonomy. These elements reinforce one another. The chapter concludes with a simple truth. Great teams don't avoid difficult conversations, they embrace them. A team that learns continuously, communicates openly, and pushes each other to grow becomes unstoppable. The circle of feedback transforms candor from a value into a living practice, shaping how we think, how we collaborate, and how we succeed. By embedding feedback into the daily fabric of work, Netflix created a culture where improvement never stops and where everyone is both a teacher and a learner. Chapter 9. Lead with context, not control. Empowering people to think like leaders. In Chapter 9, I present one of the most essential principles behind Netflix's ability to innovate quickly at scale, leading with context instead of control. This is not just a management tactic, it's a fundamental shift in how leaders view their roles. In most companies, leaders give instructions, set rules, require approvals, and manage through oversight. But at Netflix, we discovered that when you lead with context, clear information, strategic clarity, and full transparency, employees make faster, smarter, and more aligned decisions than any rulebook could ever produce. I begin by explaining why control-based leadership is so limiting. Approval chains slow everything down. Rigid policies assume employees cannot be trusted. And micromanagement signals that leaders value compliance more than creativity. But when you have a high-talent workforce, controls actually weaken the organization by suppressing initiative. Exceptional people thrive on freedom, not supervision. They want autonomy to solve problems creatively, and they do their best work when entrusted with responsibility instead of being watched. So, instead of controlling decisions, leaders must set the stage, that is, what we call context. Context includes explaining strategic priorities, financial realities, long-term goals, risks, constraints, and the reasoning behind big decisions. When employees understand the why, they can confidently decide the how. This allows Netflix to move at a speed competitors find impossible. I share examples of how this plays out in real situations. One content executive purchased expensive film rights without seeking approval, and rather than reprimand her, we celebrated her decision because she had acted with full awareness of our strategy, the competitive landscape, and the importance of acting quickly. She didn't need permission, she needed context, and she had it. This chapter also explores how context encourages peer collaboration. When people aren't required to ask a boss for approval, they naturally consult colleagues, gather insights, and pressure test decisions. This creates what I call distributed leadership, a system where decision-making power is shared across the organization, not concentrated at the top. But leading with context is far from easy. It demands far more effort from leaders than control does. You cannot simply tell people what to do, you must teach them how to think, which requires constant communication, transparency, and a willingness to share even uncomfortable truths. Leaders must be clear, repetitive, and vulnerable. They must explain the strategy over and over, ensuring the entire organization is aligned, informed, and confident in making decisions independently. A major part of this chapter discusses what happens when context is missing. Poor decisions are rarely the result of bad employees. They're the result of insufficient information. When someone makes a wrong call, we don't punish them or add more rules. Instead, we ask, did they have enough context? What information was missing? How can we improve clarity next time? Mistakes become signals pointing to gaps in leadership communication. I also dive into the limits of this model. Leading with context works only when you have a high-density talent team, when candor flows freely, and when transparency is strong. Without those pillars, autonomy becomes chaos. That's why Netflix invests so much in hiring exceptional people, sharing financial data, and building trust. Context is effective only in an environment built on maturity and alignment. An important lesson in this chapter is that leaders must resist the temptation to step in, even when they disagree with a decision. The role of a leader is not to impose their preferred solution, but to ensure the decision maker has the right context. If the context is right and the decision maker uses sound judgment, leaders must allow space for different approaches, and occasionally even for risk. The chapter closes with the central message. Control is a tax on innovation, while context is an investment that multiplies it. When employees understand the mission deeply and are trusted to act in service of it, they become strategic thinkers, not task executors. They move faster, take smarter risks, and feel a profound sense of ownership over their work. Leading with context transforms an organization from a hierarchy of approvals into a network of empowered adults capable of making decisions that propel the company forward. It is one of the key reasons Netflix continues to innovate with speed and one of the most powerful lessons modern leaders can adopt. Chapter 10. Bringing it all to the world, adapting freedom and responsibility globally. In Chapter 10, I explore one of the greatest challenges Netflix ever faced, taking our culture of freedom and responsibility, born in Silicon Valley, shaped by American norms, and sharpened through rapid innovation, and expanding it across dozens of countries, each with its own cultural identity, expectations, and communication styles. This chapter is about learning that a strong culture is not something you impose, it's something you translate, preserving its essence while adapting its expression. I begin by sharing the early shock we encountered when Netflix started hiring around the world. The foundations of our culture, candor, autonomy, lack of approvals, and radical transparency were not universal norms. In Japan, for example, open criticism is seen as confrontational. In the Netherlands, people are so direct that even Americans find the feedback unusually blunt. In Brazil, relationships are built through warmth and emotion. In India, hierarchy is deeply respected, and questioning a manager publicly can feel like a breach of etiquette. We quickly learned that simply exporting the Silicon Valley way would fail. Instead, we needed to understand how our values could be lived authentically in each context. A central theme of the chapter is this idea. You don't export culture, you export principles and let people localize the behaviors. We did not need a Japanese employee to give feedback like an American. We needed them to embrace the purpose of candor, reducing confusion, improving collaboration, and helping colleagues grow. Once people understood the why, they found their own culturally appropriate way to express it. I share examples of how Netflix teams adapted. In some countries, teams introduced softer openings to feedback conversations, phrases that eased emotional tension while still communicating the truth. In others, people delivered difficult comments privately rather than publicly. In highly hierarchical cultures, we reassured employees that questioning a leader was not disrespect, it was an act of responsibility. The point was never to force uniformity, but to preserve impact. One of the most fascinating discoveries was that cultural differences didn't weaken our model, they enriched it. In Korea, for example, teams were incredibly disciplined and execution-driven, making them ideal partners for ambitious, high-quality content production. In Mexico, teams brought creativity and boldness that significantly shaped the growth of local originals. The diversity of communication styles and perspectives made our global content strategy stronger than we could have designed from California alone. But adaptation didn't happen automatically. Leaders needed to invest heavily in context, explaining the logic of our culture in detail. We held workshops all around the world, not to teach people the Netflix way, but to help them internalize the values behind it. We emphasized that freedom requires responsibility, that transparency requires maturity, and that candor requires trust. When people understood the principles, they were empowered to practice them in a way that felt natural. This chapter also highlights mistakes. In some regions, early teams misinterpreted freedom as a lack of accountability. In others, transparency made employees anxious because they weren't used to seeing raw financial data. Instead of reverting to control, we improved clarity, reassured teams, and refined our communication. We realized that global culture building is not a one-time event, but a continuous process of listening, adjusting, and reinforcing principles. A powerful part of the chapter focuses on content production. We learned quickly that the best content doesn't come from California telling the world what to make. It comes from trusting local creators. By giving regional teams full autonomy, including the power to greenlight expensive shows, we enabled the creation of global phenomena like Kingdom, Money Heist, and Squid Game. These successes became proof that freedom and responsibility works even more powerfully on a global scale. The chapter ends with a simple truth. A strong culture is flexible in form, but unwavering in principle. To bring Netflix's culture to the world, we didn't ask employees to become Americans. We asked them to become owners, people who act with judgment, embrace transparency, and pursue excellence. By respecting the diversity of global teams while preserving the core values, we built a company where freedom doesn't dilute across borders, it multiplies. Chapter 10 is a testament to the idea that culture is not what you write down, it's what you live, together across languages, customs, and continents.